Hello and welcome to our new podcast, Performance People, with me, Georgie.
And me, Ben. This podcast is all about people who know about performance.
We're going to talk to some of the best at sport, business, entertainment and politics.
And chat to those who have been on a journey to the top with them.
Joining us on today's Performance People is an ocean swimmer and campaigner and his right-hand man.
Lewis Pugh is the first person to undertake long-distance swims in every ocean of the world, creating publicity to, as he puts it, shake the lapels of world leaders.
And joining Lewis is sports lawyer and performance mind coach David Becker. David's one of Lewis's closest friends. He's also helped him on every single one of his ocean adventures.
Together, they're performance people on a mission.
The speed of the crisis, it's almost as if glaciers now are moving faster than our world leaders. This is the defining issue of our generation. We'll do whatever it takes now to try and get at least 30% of our oceans fully protected now by 2030. This is my life's mission.
It's often said that someone with a strong enough why can put up with any how. And Lewis has this emotional juice, this drive. In order for Lewis to swim at the North Pole, he had to be in a highly enhanced state, a peak state, if you like.
So thank you, both of you, for coming on. I think we're probably best off by establishing how you two know each other before we launch into how everything's unfolded since then for both of you in your respective worlds. Maybe Lewis, can you start by explaining how you met David and the role that he plays in your life?
It was very, very simple. I sat next to him on the first day of university in Cape Town. First day of law school, and I often look back at my life and think to myself, it might be very different had I not sat next to him, because when you go to university, you often sort of sit in your groups and you sometimes don't mix, but David turned out to be an amazing friend, and that's been a friendship which has gone on for well over 30 years now.
And David, we're going to track right back to Lewis's childhood in a little bit and sort of explain how he's now the man that he is and what's led him to do the incredible things that he's done. But I mean, you as his friend, sort of watching him over these however many years it's been, I don't want to put an age thing on it, but however many years it's been, I suspect a couple of decades. How has he sort of evolved as a person? I mean, we've spoken a few times about this, but how has he changed as a person for you? But your friendship remains so strong.
Yes, it's been an extraordinary journey, particularly when I think back to those early days at university down in Cape Town when we were studying law. And the thing which stands out for me is just how shy and reserved Lewis was. He kept to himself, didn't say much, and there was certainly no inkling then that he would be speaking on stages across the world as a diplomat, as an ocean advocate. So it's been incredible to see Lewis develop and really harness the different aspects to his armory. You know, as a speaker, as a philanthropist, as an athlete, as an ambassador, a patron of the oceans now for the UN. So to see all those aspects of Lewis develop and progress to the point where he is now has been hugely rewarding for me as a close friend and confidant.
David's had a huge role to play, Lewis, in that storyline, which we'll get to. But just take us right back to the beginning and how it all started for you, how life started for you, and how some of that early childhood bit has influenced what came next.
I grew up in Plymouth. When you grow up in Plymouth, Plymouth describes itself as Britain's ocean city. And I think it is that. When you grow up in Plymouth, you're always looking at ships coming in and out. The Royal Navy's based there. And you're constantly looking out over the horizon. So I was no different to any of the other kids in Plymouth looking out over the horizon. I dreamt that one day I'd be going out to sea. Fast forward until I was 10 years old and my family emigrated out to South Africa. Initially, we went to the Eastern Cape, but later on we moved to Cape Town. And I went to a school which overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. And I just used to look out over the Atlantic Ocean. Ever since I was a little boy, I always dreamt that I would go out to sea, but also that I would go to the polar regions. And then being in Cape Town, I was just that much closer to the polar regions. And I used to look outside my classroom and just think, 5,000 kilometers south of here is Antarctica. I want to go to Antarctica. And that's kind of how my life sort of started. These dreams of going to these places, and growing up in Cape Town. Also, one learns to love swimming, because on either side you have magnificent places to swim. So in Cape Town, on the one side, you can swim in the Atlantic Ocean. On the other side, you can swim in the Indian Ocean. You can swim on flat water, cold water, rough water. You're right next to the Cape of Good Hope if you want to swim in really rough water. If you want to swim with sharks, you've got everything there if you want to become an endurance swimmer.
I was gonna say, is this a good time to bring up your shark phobia again, Georgie?
It keeps
Maybe Lewis
repeating
could give us
itself,
some more
this. It's
tips
a
of
theme.
swimming with the sharks and how to cope with that.
No, I mean, sharks are a reality. So when you swim in Cape Town, you are swimming in waters which are the home of the great white shark. And these are some of the most incredible animals on Earth. And in all my swims subsequent to the original swims which I did in Cape Town, there's always been some type of predator that you're having to deal with, whether that be a great white shark, whether that be a hippo, a crocodile, a polar bear. And one grows to learn how to respect and to love these animals. But I mean, the great white shark is a fearsome animal, and you need to be careful when you're swimming in waters where there are great white sharks.
Note to self.
We had another eminent naturalist on one of our podcasts who was giving us the impression that he felt that he could talk down a tarantula spider at certain moments, or at least be able to get into the mind of the tarantula to decide whether it was going to have a go at cracking him or
decipher
not.
its body language. I mean, is that the same with a
Yeah.
great white shark? Can you figure out from the body language what might happen next?
I'm very, very cautious with great white sharks. I mean, these are some of the the biggest animals you can ever imagine. I was doing a swim around the Cape of Good Hope early on in my career, and I was swimming with a few other swimmers. That's one of the most important things. If you are going to swim with great white sharks, make sure you're not the only person. Anyway, there were a few of us who were swimming around the Cape of Good Hope, and it happened so incredibly quickly. This enormous great white, and it was like a torpedo came underneath us. And your first reaction when you see such a big animal come underneath you and so close, I mean, if I had taken a stroke, I would have touched it. Your first reaction is, oh, and you think you're going to be taken. And then there's a kind of, you gasp, and then you look down, and then you almost feel a draw towards it, because it is such a magnificent creature. Anyway, as quickly as it came, it disappeared. But I've never seen 4 swimmers move so quickly towards the support boat as when that happened. And it disappeared, and then the skipper just said, "Come on, guys, carry on." And so we did. And we successfully completed that swim.
It's a serious brown pants moment, though, presumably.
Yes, I suppose the closest I've come to one is halfway between New Zealand and Antarctica is an island called Campbell Island. It's at around about sort of 60, 70 degrees south. And it's an incredible island. They have these great big fur seals down there. And when you see these David Attenborough documentaries and you see these animals just clashing on beaches down in South Georgia and places like that, I want you to imagine that enormous great seals just clashing and fighting, and then they've got blood all over their necks and they're fighting. Anyway, I did a swim near there, and one of these things came for me. And it's quite terrifying because it happens so incredibly quickly. I was lucky I had a New Zealand skipper with me who dragged me out, and we were literally seconds from being taken by that animal. So, and they're just trying to play. When you start swimming in Antarctica and the Arctic, you can bet your bottom dollar that none of these animals, penguins, polar bears, seals, leopard seals, elephant seals, none of them have ever seen somebody swimming before. So they just want to see what's happening.
Is coming face to face with a shark more or less terrifying than speaking on a stage in front of the Queen at the Commonwealth?
Speaking at Westminster Abbey on the 70th anniversary of the Commonwealth, and you've got to get it right. And there was so much practicing that went on, 3 dress rehearsals, etc. And then you've got somebody who at the time was a 94-year-old monarch at the back of Westminster Abbey. They've got 2,000 people in there. You've got majority of the royal family. You got the Prime Minister and all cabinet ministers. At the back of the room, you got children as young as 12. How do you pitch a story to somebody who is a 94-year-old monarch and also can resonate with 12-year-old children? That's not an easy task.
So
But ultimately, you've got
what
to tell
was the
stories.
speech you made? So what was the main crux of the story that you told that you think probably was able to resonate with that demographic?
Well, it was interesting because we had all these dress rehearsals and there's a lot of form and substance. So it starts off with Your Majesty, Your Royal Highnesses, Lords, Ladies, High Commissioners from across the Commonwealth, ladies and gentlemen, etc. I was given 7 minutes and I thought to myself, I'm not going to spend 30 seconds or 7 minutes going through that. And so I said to the person who was responsible for this, who was a canon at Westminster Abbey, I said, listen, I'm from the Southern Hemisphere, okay? We've got to drop some of these formalities. Otherwise, we just waste an awful lot of time and you lose the audience immediately. So I said, I'm going to start right at the North Pole. And so I think my words were, and he warned me beforehand. He said to me, please don't look at the Queen, because people often look down at, because you're standing up on a pulpit. And he said, you look down at the Queen and you're expecting a reaction. And that's quite uncomfortable for her. So just don't look at her and just look at the TV cameras. So anyway, so I started off the speech with, I'm standing at the North Pole and I start taking off my clothes until I'm just down to my Speedos. And then I made the mistake of looking down at the Queen. And she'd had her head down. And then she looked up and you could just see that she was thinking, this is the first time I've heard this in Westminster Abbey. And I wonder where this is going. So I spoke to people about swimming across the North Pole and that commitment which I needed to actually dive in. And the commitment which all of us around the Commonwealth now need to protect our oceans. And the Commonwealth is made up of 54 nations. And I said, our common wealth is our oceans, because most of the Commonwealth nations are maritime nations. They've got coastlines. And I said, collectively, we can do something very, very important and lead the world on this. So that was my message.
Go on, share your Queen story, because you've met the Queen as well. Go on, let's share Queen story. I don't have one, so I can't contribute. And David, I don't know if you can, but it's quite interesting to hear it from these two.
So I was invited to Windsor Castle for a dinner and to stay the night. But being totally disorganized, as I often am, and I'd been overseas somewhere, so I turned up rather late in my sponsored sailing car, drive into the castle grounds and get ushered off to this accommodation to get changed quickly because I'm late, to realise I've got my dinner jacket, but I haven't got any studs for my dress shirt. I haven't got a bow tie. So now I'm in a complete flap.
Can you imagine?
And some very kind equerry, I guess, came along, and probably happens a lot more than we'd imagine.
They probably have a stash
suddenly
of them somewhere.
these studs turn up. And then I go rushing off to try and find the reception, but get completely lost in Windsor Castle. End up, going in it was just a disaster basically. But anyway, it was an amazing opportunity to meet some brilliant people. And they do this thing. They take you in after dinner. They go into the library, and for each of the guests, they have made a presentation. So for me, they had, I think it was George V. They had a lot of memorabilia around his yacht, Britannia. And they also had, which was the most amazing thing, the bullet that killed Admiral Lord Nelson. They had the bullet. So to
I
hold
love
this
that they've
bullet,
taken the time to dedicate. Each guest had a different.
It was one wonderful experience. It was very, very generous, and special moment, not one to forget.
David, can you ever have imagined when you alluded to it earlier, but when you met Lewis at university and he was shy and quite quiet and reserved, ever imagine that he would have been giving a speech in front of the Queen in that context at that time?
No, I couldn't imagine it. And I was there that day in Westminster. Lewis invited me, and it was an extraordinary day, really, because you could have heard a pin drop in Westminster Abbey. And Lewis, as he said, had only 7 minutes to deliver a very important message. So it was an extraordinary day, one that will live long in my memory. And, that speech is available on YouTube. I encourage everybody to go and listen to it. It was certainly one of the most impactful speeches that he's made.
So, Lewis, from obviously you were studying, you two, at law school in Cape Town. And then from there, what happened? What happened between there and your decision to become an advocate for the ocean?
Myself and David arrived here in the United Kingdom. We were in our sort of late 20s. I worked for a few years in a big London law firm, but then there comes a moment you've got to ask yourself, are you doing what you were meant to do with your life? Are you enjoying what you're doing? Are you passionate about what you're doing? And if I ask myself that question, I ask myself that question an awful lot of times, I realized I wasn't happy with what I was doing. There then came a moment when I went on a trip to Norway, and this was a beginning of a complete love affair with Norway. And I went all the way, I got on a bicycle, I cycled all the way along the coast, all the way to the most northern place in Norway. And there was this beautiful golden beach, and it was a crisp, cold day. And I thought to myself, I was hot and I was sweaty. Let me just jump in the sea here, just quickly, in and out. This is high Arctic. So I put my bike down, I ran into the sea, and it was proper cold. I mean, it was bracing. I was very, very thin in those days, but it was hugely invigorating. And so I ran up and down the beach, dived in again, and I swam for about 2-3 minutes. And then I thought, this is a little bit better. And I did this a few times, and I just absolutely loved it. A year later, I came back because I just wanted to do a big swim there. And so I swam around North Cape, top of Norway. And that led to a journey whereby every year I was going a little bit further north into the higher Arctic until 2007. I had effectively no longer doing law. And David, this moment came with me where I decided I just want to swim. And during these swims, I began noticing how the oceans were changing. They were changing so rapidly. And we're doing swims all over the world. And then it came to 2007, and I decided to do this swim across the North Pole. This was a really big swim to highlight, the enormous changes which were taking place in the Arctic. And David came on that expedition and was obviously crucial in working out how to get your mind ready for something which is so terrifying as swimming across the North Pole.
And how do you, David, how do you get Lewis's mind in the right place for doing something like that?
Yeah, we knew instinctively that doing something as dangerous as that, you needed to prepare mentally extremely well. It wasn't just going to be a very tough physical endeavor, but also going to require immense mental conditioning and fortitude. So I had been an endurance athlete myself and had done a BA in psychology as part of my law degree, and I was fascinated by human motivation. By that stage, I'd been doing a number of endurance events myself, and I started sharing with Lewis some of the techniques that I had learned to help him prepare for this swim in particular. We'd started working together a few years before on some mental conditioning aspects, but this was something else. To swim in a Speedo at minus 1.8 degrees for nearly 20 minutes at the North Pole was extremely life-threatening. So I deployed a number of sort of mental skills, really, and he was a great student. He took it all very seriously. One was a technique or a skill called neuro-associative conditioning, which is based on the work of Pavlov. You'll remember that Pavlov used to bring meat to his dogs, and they would cause them to salivate, and he would ring a bell at the same time. And he did this over and over and over again. Brought the meat, rang the bell, etc. And the ringing of the bell, pretty soon enough, induced a state of salivation. That was the trigger or the anchor. And I knew that we could, in order for Lewis to swim at the North Pole, he had to be in a highly enhanced state, a peak state, if you like. So through a process of neuro-associative conditioning, we installed a number of triggers or anchors, which, when fired off, would change Lewis's physiology. And we found that he could actually raise his core body temperature before he even got into the water, which was extraordinary at the time. And we had one of the world's leading sports scientists up there at the time, Professor Tim Noakes, and Lewis actually had a rectal thermometer. And so we could actually track his core body temperature. And we found through this process of conditioning that we were able to use these triggers or anchors to literally change his physiology. And then, of course, I also worked a lot on his beliefs because he needed to be able to see the end result very firmly in his mind eye. And I used a process called envisioning, which is really visualization, but on steroids, taking each of the 5 senses and the submodalities, as we call them. So, for example, if you visualize something, you can change the intensity of that experience for your nervous system by making it fill up the whole of your mind, making it bright, moving, fully associated, etc. So we did that with each of his 5 senses until he could see the end result very clearly in his mind's eye. And that process also helped to instill the beliefs in him that he could actually undertake this pioneering swim. And then I guess another aspect that we worked with a lot is Lewis's sense of purpose. It's often said that someone with a strong enough why can put up with any how. And Lewis has this emotional juice, this drive, which comes a lot from his youth. And harnessing or tapping into that was a very powerful force. When you're standing on the edge of the ice at the North Pole, looking into this black water in freezing conditions, you've got to have a very strong sense of purpose, a very strong why. And similarly, I remember there was a swim which Lewis did where he swam for 50 days along the English Channel. When you're swimming for that length of time, doing something so grueling, you've got to have a very, very strong purpose, a very strong drive. So we tapped into that. And, fortunately, he was in a position where he had a strong mindset, and that saw him through it.
Lewis, how did you actually respond when you first hit that water in the pole? And what was the sensation like on your body, on your skin? Was it just the most intense shock ever? And did all the preparation with Dave, did that work, or did you have to go and have another crack at it?
So the preparation really helped, but nothing can prepare you for when you actually arrive there. I mean, it's a really terrifying place. So I want you to imagine we've sailed for 7 days. We've on a Russian ship. We finally arrived at the North Pole, and in front of us a big, large, open patch of sea, and that water is completely black. Anyway, we walk down onto the edge of the ice. We look into the water, and you realize that this is a high consequence environment. If you get it wrong, within the next half an hour, you won't be alive. And I don't care how brave you are. When you actually look at that type of water, it's frightening. Anyway, what we did is we laid out flags all the way along the line. So we had 29 people in the team. They came from 10 nations. And so we put one of these flags all the way along. And these were the markers which I had to swim to get to there. But the Inuit people, so the indigenous people who live high up in the Canadian Arctic and in Greenland, they always say that in every single person, there is an almighty battle taking place in the mind. And it's a battle between 2 wolves. One is a good wolf and the other one is a bad wolf. And which is a wolf which wins? And the Inuit people say it's a wolf which you feed. And I remember thinking to myself just how, if things do go wrong, this dreadful thought came into my mind before I was about to get in. If things do go wrong, how long is it going to take for my frozen body to sink all the way to the bottom of the ocean? Which is just the worst possible thought. But I was never able to completely silence that bad wolf.
Are you a religious man at all? I mean, was that a moment where you thought, you're going into something, not that sure you're going to come out of it the other side? Is that something that you thought about going into it?
Ben, it was very, very frightening standing there on the ice. And we had done a test swim the day before, which had gone horribly wrong. I spent too long in the water. I came out, my hands were absolutely frozen. And that was just after about 5-6 minutes in the water. And the 1 kilometer we thought would take me around about somewhere between 18 and 20 minutes to complete. And so if this had happened after just 5 minutes, what would then happen after 18 minutes? And I'll be honest with you, there was an awful lot of praying. But I also did believe, and this, I hope this doesn't sound too grandiose, that this was what I was meant to do with my life. That I looked back at my life and I put it all together, and I said, this place is incredibly special. This place is melting so quickly. There are now large open patches of sea at the North Pole. And Lewis, if you can swim across here, you can send a message to world leaders about the health of our planet, because you shouldn't be able to swim here. This is what you were meant to do with your life. Put your head down and just swim. And so I dived into the water, and you asked me what that feeling is. I mean, it is, I could barely breathe. I am gasping for air, and I've just got to try and focus on just doing the first 20, 30 strokes. And then I start counting strokes. And then I'm just looking up at David, and he's giving me signals about how far we are in the swim. We come to certain, all these nations' flags were there. And whenever I came to a nation's flag, David had said to me, just spend a bit of time slowly swimming past that flag, thinking about all the men, all the women from that nation who've inspired you and helped you so much to be here today. And then just get to the next flag. So we never thought of it as a 1 kilometer swim. I just had to swim 100 meters and then recalibrate. Now another 100 meters until I got to the end.
It's an incredible story.
David, your role in this, because you've prepped Lewis and you're waiting to see what unfolds, and there comes a point presumably where you can't influence what happens. It's Lewis in the water, and it will be what it will be. So what's that like, watching that unfold? I mean, you've done your training, you are a mental coach, you've done the work, you know what works and what the triggers are for Lewis and how he's affected by, various different things. And you've got his body temperature is where it needs to be. But after that, you're sort of helpless after that, aren't you? It's really about Lewis and the water and what happens next. I mean, what's that like, just observing?
David, can I just answer this? And I tell you the reason why I want to answer this is I've just been on an English Channel swim where I've watched somebody swim the width of the English Channel. And I thought it was going to be a 10-hour swim, and it turned out to be nearly a 13-hour swim. And I'm telling you, when you're on the boat and you're watching somebody fighting, and this kid was fighting against a tremendous current, it is horrible watching it. And I want you to multiply that by 50 when somebody is in really, really cold water. It makes agonizing. So I've watched a few people swim in really cold water. It is horrible to watch. I just can't imagine what David was going through watching that on that day. Not only was it extremely cold, but we just didn't know what the outcome was going to be. We didn't know that a human could swim for so long in water, which is minus 1.7.
Yeah, I mean, I would reiterate what Lewis is saying. It was absolutely terrifying because, he was endeavoring to be a pioneer, and that involves breaking boundaries. But he had given us a clear mandate that if he started to swim badly, in other words, his body literally started shutting down, we had to pull him out of the water. So we had obviously safety plans in place, but I was part of probably 2 or 3 people that was empowered to make that decision, along with the doctor that we had on board and Professor Tim Noakes. And so we were faced with this choice of having to constantly assess, knowing that his body temperature was dropping drastically and that his functions were starting to slow down. Do we pull him out of the water? And so we had the responsibility of watching him and watching his swimming stroke in particular to see. And on 1 or 2 swims, there was a swim in the Arctic a few years prior to that where we very, very nearly pulled him out of the water. But he managed to correct his stroke and keep himself going. So I'll never, ever forget that day in the North Pole and if you watch it on the video on YouTube, there's a great video, if you search Lewis Pugh North Pole swim, where you'll see him coming in at the end. And it was terrifying because his bodily functions had slowed down so considerably that he was speaking like a 4-year-old boy. And to see my closest friend in that state, severely compromised in his bodily functions was, terrifying.
I mean, the reason why you speak like a 4-year-old boy is because when you get into extremely cold water, the body's really clever. It shunts all your warm blood to your core to defend it, to protect it. It makes your arms and your legs get extremely cold. The other part of your body, which obviously gets extremely cold, is your tongue. Your tongue literally freezes like a lollipop in your mouth. And so when you come out And then David starts talking to me. I mean, it's impossible to speak because I've got a lollipop in my mouth, and that's also quite frightening for the medical team.
So all the lessons that you learned doing that swim, didn't you have to reverse the psychology for the Mount Everest swim? Because and just tell us a little bit about how you approached that and perhaps overlooked a particular area which you probably should have focused in on, and how that tripped you up when you did the Mount Everest swim, because that's a fascinating sort of story in terms of what can go wrong with an approach that you thought would work.
The thing about Mount Everest, obviously, is it's a very high mountain. I mean, when you walk up to Everest, and people say it's impressive, but it's hard to explain how incredibly impressive it is. You walk around the corner, and then there's Everest in front of you, and it's a big mountain, right? And it's also obviously incredibly high, and with altitude, it's very, very difficult to breathe. And so we tried to swim the way we had always swum, which is fast, crawl, aggressive, generating that heat. That was disastrous on Mount Everest. We tried it when we first arrived there, and I thought I was going to drown. I could just barely breathe. And so we changed the tactics completely. And so instead of swimming fast, I swam as slowly as I could. It sounds counterintuitive, but that was the only way you can swim, because you've got to preserve your oxygen. Instead of swimming crawl, I swam breaststroke, because then I can breathe whenever I need to. And lastly, I remember the leader of the expedition saying to me, he said, "Lewis," he pointed up to Everest and he said, "You can't bully Mount Everest." And so he said, "I want you to swim with real humility." And that really worked. So we swam breaststroke very, very slowly across this lake. But it's an incredible place to swim. I mean, to be up there and to see those magic mountains, it's unbelievable. The reason why we were doing this swim was to highlight the fact that the glaciers in the Himalayas now are beginning to melt away. And, this provides constant water supply to India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, some of the most populous and important countries in the world. Without water, there's nothing which you can do. So these areas are sadly a cocktail for conflict unless we really get a grip on the climate crisis now.
David, I just wanted to pick up on what Lewis just said there, though, about the Mount Everest swim. So obviously this 1.6 degree of temperature change and how you approach that and everything around that was your thinking for the pole swim. But just explain how you had to reverse the psychology of that for Everest and why it was so important to do that.
Yeah, so as Lewis alluded to, usually we would get him into a highly enhanced, a peak state, if you like, before he, dives into the water. And what we realized during the practice swim was that he just wasn't getting enough oxygen into his lungs, that particular approach, that strategy was not going to work for this environment. And it was a great lesson for us as a team because we learned that just because a strategy has worked in the past doesn't mean that it's going to always work depending on the circumstances that you're in. And so when we left the practice from that day, we realized that we were going to have to completely change our strategy. And I had done a lot of meditation. So I said to Lewis, right, we're going to get into this meditative state before you swim. And he looked at me as if I was crazy, I remember. He says, "How do I do that?" So I remember we hiked up to this lake. It was very difficult to get up to this lake. It's the highest lake in the world. And we hiked very slowly to make sure that he kept his heart rate down. And then when we got there, he sat in a tent on the side of the lake and we did a little meditation just to make sure that his heart rate was low, because then it meant that he was taking in less oxygen. And at that altitude, that made a huge difference. And so we had to completely change the strategy. Lewis sort of slid into the water rather than dived in, and off he went, as he said, swimming breaststroke. He still had to do a mile. But of course, the challenge with that was that he exposed himself for longer in the water, which was also a great risk at that temperature and at that altitude.
And what about the idea of coming up with the idea of where you'd want to swim and what you want to do? How do you do that, Lewis? What do you what do you focus on? Is it about highlighting the plight of something in particular, or is it about getting round the oceans in a particular order? I mean, how do you choose what you're going to do, and how do you take it from an idea to a logistical challenge to the challenge itself? I mean, because that must be quite a process in itself. And David, perhaps afterwards you can talk about how difficult it is also to make these things happen, to bring them to life.
Georgie, my parents loved geography. And we had this enormous great atlas, big Times atlas in the living room. And every day a page was turned. And I always used to go down there. I used to look at it. I used to think, where can I swim? And I'm always looking for a place where I can swim, which can carry a very, very simple message. So the message has to be, yes, the message is aimed at world leaders, but it's got to be simple enough for young school children to understand. So here's a guy who's going to swim across the North Pole, across an open patch of sea, to highlight the melting of the Arctic sea ice. Anybody can understand that, okay? Or here's somebody who's going to be swimming on Mount Everest. And people say, well, how on earth can you swim on Mount Everest? And you say, well, because now there are lakes appearing on the glaciers because they're melting away. So I'm always looking for a place where I can tell a story. I was looking for a swim from 2005. I was looking for a swim for 2 years to do, a really big swim that could carry the climate change message. And I was looking through the Times Atlas all the time, looking in the Arctic, looking in the Antarctic. And it was right in front of me, the North Pole. But I'd never thought about swimming there because I'd been constrained by previous swims where with English channels, as swimmers, we always started on land and finished on land. And I never thought, well, what about just starting on ice and finishing on ice? And I looked at the North Pole the one day and I suddenly saw it and I thought, there it is. Erder. Why can I not see it? It is right there. And these, I've had these Erder moments now throughout my career. I looking for a swim where I can carry a really simple message. But there's the swim, there's the message, but then there's the stuff which happens afterwards, which is going around, meeting heads of state and trying to get these areas protected. You can't just do the swim to highlight issues. There's got to be the follow-up afterwards, and that's the role which I fulfill in my role as UN patron of the oceans.
Yeah. Talk to us a bit about that, Lewis, because you've met some pretty influential and I imagine pretty intimidating people. We talked about the Queen, but there's been one or two others and
some interesting characters along the way.
Yeah, perhaps. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, and I also choose a swim based on, because if you look at the ocean, you look at all the different things which are impacting the oceans. I mean, at the moment, we've got the climate crisis, we've got serious overfishing, and we've got plastic pollution all over the world. So ultimately, the swim is going to carry one of those messages. I ask myself when I'm choosing a specific swim, is the issue big enough to matter, but small enough to win? Is it big enough to matter, small enough to win? There's a place down in Antarctica called the Ross Sea. It is simply the most incredible place. If you sail from the bottom of New Zealand and you sail for about 2 weeks, and finally you arrive in the Ross Sea. And it's a place where you see these humpback whales, you see, emperor penguins, leopard seals. It is one of the most impressive places on the planet, and one of the last wildernesses. This place was right on the front edge of, overfishing. Big fishing fleets were coming down there and hoovering up a fish called Antarctic toothfish. And this place was obviously incredibly important also for scientists. It's one of the last wilderness areas on Earth. For 17 years, international diplomats have been trying to get this area protected. I felt so strongly about it. I spoke to David and I said, let us go down there and let's do this swim. And all the international community, they'd all agreed to protect it, but under international law, 2 nations still had to agree it, and that was Russia and China. And it was in Obama's last year of office. He sent John Kerry through to Beijing, and John Kerry was able to get the Chinese across the line. So the last remaining country which had to be persuaded was Russia. And so I said to David, David, listen, let's go down to the Ross Sea. Because I bet you the Russians, they haven't even heard about what's happening. The Russians are dealing with so many issues. And it's enormous countries, 11 time zones. And they were dealing with so many issues at the time. I bet this has never, ever gone up to the president. Let's go there. Let's do a swim. And let's go to Russia and let's try and persuade them. So off we jumped. We got on board a ship. We sailed down to the Ross Sea. And the only way I can describe it, Ben, is imagine sailing along and suddenly you see something which is like the White Cliffs of Dover. But it's not the White Cliffs of Dover. It's a Ross ice shelf. So you've got this massive ice shelf and you've got the wind tunneling off this from the bottom of Antarctica, coming down onto the sea. It is so cold that the sea, the surface level of the sea is freezing. The air temperatures are well over minus 20 air temperatures. The sea is minus 1.7. I had my wife with me, and I said to her just before the swim, I said, please just go up and down along the edge of the ice and just have a look and just make sure that there are no leopard seals in the water. So she got lowered down to the water into a zodiac. She went up and down. And I watched as a wave hit the side of the boat, came up and froze literally as slush midair and hit her as slush. And then she came back into the boat and then she said, we're ready. And I got lowered down into the water. It was absolutely terrifying. I thought I was going to do a kilometer swim. I did 5 minutes. And I said to myself, I couldn't feel my hands. I couldn't feel my arms. It was the first time this ever happened. The conditions were so tough. I said to myself, if you don't get out right now, Lewis, you will never see Moscow. And in 35 years, I failed on 3 swims. And that was one of them. Anyway, I got out. We sailed to Argentina. Myself and David then arrived in Moscow. And we didn't know what type of reception we would get in Moscow. But we met an incredible man called Slava Fetisov. Slava is an ice hockey legend. He would be to Russia what Muhammad Ali was to America. And he said to us, he said, you know, Lewis, the world, and he had been a defender. He said in ice hockey, he'd won 2 Olympic gold medals. He's huge in Russia. He said, you know, the world needs more defenders and protectors. And then he decided to take us to all the key decision makers who would make the decision. So the Minister of the Environment, the Minister of Defense, the head of security, all the people around President Putin. And for a 2-year period, I was shuttling backwards and forwards there. And then it was just one of these most amazing moments, which I'll never, ever forget, when Russia agreed to sign this deal. And this protected area now is the size of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany all put together. But that's, you know, the back end stuff, which is significantly hard because you've got to persuade a nation why it's in their national interest to protect something which is thousands of kilometers away.
Pushing the boundaries is something that you're obviously comfortable with because you have to be in order to do what you do, because it's the very nature of pioneering, isn't it? But there's going to be times where you're going to presumably really piss some people off in this process where you decide to just do something and people say, well, no, you can't really do that. And you can't. I mean, that must be like a red rag to a bull with you. It must be like, no, I am going to do it. I'm just going to get on with it. And this is going to be what happens. David, just explain a little bit about this Thames swim and what happened as a result of Lewis not conforming.
Lewis started his swim at the source of the Thames, and I actually remember he got very ill and I had to take him to hospital somewhere near Oxford, but he recovered from that, got back in the water the next day and carried on swimming. But it was made very clear to us that he would not be able to swim past Westminster, otherwise he'd be arrested. We got a clear message, I think, from the harbour master. Was that the correct title I'm referring to there, Lewis?
Yes, it
yeah,
is.
the harbour master. So he made it clear to us that if Lewis went past there, he would be arrested because he'd be in contravention of the shipping regulations. Of course, Lewis, being a maritime lawyer, was well aware of the maritime regulations, but he wasn't having any of it. So, of course, he planned to carry on. And when he got to Westminster, thankfully there was probably 1,000 journalists on the sides of the shore. And Lewis had arranged to stop and meet the then Prime Minister Tony Blair at number 10. So I remember there was this extraordinary scene where Lewis got out, put on some shorts over his Speedo, put on his slip-slops, and walked to number 10 to meet Tony Blair with the threat of being arrested hanging over his head. But of course, that didn't happen. He met Tony Blair, jumped straight back in the water and carried on swimming, and the rest is history.
So what was that? Tell us about that walk up Downing Street where you ended up sort of, knocking on the door and in you went. I mean, what was that? What was that whole experience like? And what on earth possessed you to do it that way? Why did you want to do it that way? Why was it important for you to make that statement?
The most extraordinary moment the day before when the Prime Minister's office called us up and said, Lewis, when you get to London, the Prime Minister is going to come down and try and see you. But if he's held up, can you quickly run up to number 10 and come and meet us? Well, it was one of these lovely moments when the harbour master called me up and said, Mr. Pugh, if you go past Teddington, I am going to arrest you. And I said to him, I said, he was an admiral, former Royal Navy admiral who is now running the harbour, the Port of London Authority. And I said to him, Admiral, listen, both of us are going to look silly if you arrest me because the Prime Minister is coming down. And you could just hear this, very few times in life do you have this moment where you can really take on a job's worth. And I just said that, and he just said, well, send one of your people down to my office and we'll see what can be done. And he slammed down the phone. Anyway, I swam into London. I walked up to number 10. And here's the interesting thing. I spoke to Tony Blair. He was obviously, he was very pleasant. But I was too young in my career. I was early 30s. I hadn't fought enough battles then. When you're in your early 30s, you're an experienced swimmer, but you're not an experienced campaigner. Now, when I'm going in there, I'm telling them exactly what we want and exactly what we feel they need to do. And you don't get fobbed off. So in order to be a good swimmer, you need to be young. In order to be a good campaigner, you need a lot of grey hairs.
And that's a great comment you made. You've got to have the experience, but you still need to have the endurance. So do you feel like you're in your prime right now, Lewis? What's next on the agenda?
No, to say to any swimmer that, so I'm 52 years old, that I am actually in my prime. I honestly believe that right now because I can still swim with the young thrusters, but at the same time, I can still sit down with Putin's inner circle or with the Prime Minister or any of them and explain to them what I feel needs to be done and hold them to account.
Lewis, we've had this debate with a few other people that have been on the show, on the podcast. What in your view do governments need to do? And is this a challenge that governments, because they need to be elected in most parts of the world, that they can't make these difficult decisions, which may be going to mean in the short term they become unelectable because issues we're seeing around Europe in particular at the moment with the cost of energy crisis and so on. Is there another body? Should there be another body that can really push this agenda through and make these changes stick? Because governments can't really do that in most places.
Yeah, we're seeing now, especially in Europe, how ineffective governments are. So, imagine if you are Liz Truss now, and you're your first day at work, and you realize all the issues you're facing. You're facing the war in Ukraine. You're facing an energy crisis. You're facing a cost of living crisis. Everything's a crisis.
Yeah.
You're dealing with all the impact of COVID. Just so many issues you are dealing with. The environment is just one of them. And my message to those world leaders is, yes, but the defining issue of our generation will be the health of our planet. We're the first generation that can do something properly about limiting the climate crisis, but we are the last generation also that can do something about it. I personally, because I've been to so many of these climate summits, have seen just how slowly world leaders and governments are moving. And yet I've also been I give lots of speeches to businesses and realized how quickly they can respond. A business has to respond to its customers' and if it doesn't respond quickly enough, the customer goes elsewhere. And so they're having to respond a lot quicker. And I think that's probably where we're going to see the significant changes taking place. Also, we as individuals also have an incredibly important role to play. We can't just leave it to governments, or the governments must set policy. We can't just leave it to companies. Each of us has got a role to play. And my position is very, very clear that every single day when we make a purchase, we make a decision about the future of our planet. If it's the food we eat, the clothes we wear, how we get to work, how we heat or cool our homes, every single one of those is a purchase and a decision about our future. And I'm urging people, please be incredibly conscious about what we purchase now, because it all makes a difference.
Lewis, you're always putting your head above the parapet to talk about climate change and the situation that we're in at the minute. Does it ever feel like a lonely place? We talk to a lot of people about people who sort of step out of comfort zones and people that do that with a solo mission in mind. I mean, do you ever feel lonely in that conversation, or does that ever creep in?
So exactly this time last year, I was doing this swim across Greenland. I was doing this swim across a place called the Ilulissat Glacier. And this glacier now is moving at a speed of 40 meters per day in summer. 40 meters per day. And I witnessed a mass carving. I want you to imagine a fjord, which is 80 kilometers long. And at the end of the fjord is this glacier, and enormous icebergs, a kilometer tall, are falling into the sea there. And I witnessed a mass carving where literally thousands and thousands and thousands of icebergs were just pouring out to sea. It was like a river of icebergs. And I was lowering myself down into this water. And next to me, I had this Inuit lady called Annika Kroch, who was driving the boat. I had my Dr. Charlotte Haldane, and then a cameraman and a videographer. And I was having to swim past some of these icebergs. And icebergs are so dangerous to swim past, because a kilometer tall iceberg, is obviously, you've got 100 meters above the water, you've got 900 meters below the water, and sometimes they can rotate and become unstable. And suddenly you can be 500 meters away and this iceberg is coming up underneath you really quickly. So it's a really dangerous place to do a swim. And as I was swimming, and I was so cold, deep down to the core, and I'm seeing these changes taking place, I'm thinking to myself, are the real decision makers actually hearing you? Are they hearing you? And it's a question I ask myself all the time. And I've spent my life now.
Do you think they are?
Some certainly are. I mean, to get the Ross Sea protected was the most amazing experience, but we need to have so much more. The speed of the crisis, it's almost as if glaciers now are moving faster than our world leaders.
Lewis, this is a really dark thought, but I just want to ask you, and you sort of talked about it previously when you talked about one of your swims. But is it still, like, at this stage in your life now, and everything that you've done and accomplished, and everything that you've achieved, if the worst thing happened, if I'm trying to think of the best way of putting this. Hang on, let's have a think about.
If it didn't swim anymore.
No. My point is that would you die for your cause? I suppose is my question, because it's such an unbelievable undertaking. The things that you do and the challenges and environments you put yourself in. I mean, it's easy just to talk about it in a colloquial way, but it is a death-defying thing that you do every time you put your body in the water. It's a life-threatening scenario. So, is that something you've thought of? Are you prepared to go there?
I'm incredibly conscious when I lower myself into the water, when I dive into the sea, that this could be the last swim. Be under no illusions. But relating back to what David said, about teams, I mitigate against a risk, not so much when I'm standing there about to dive into the water. I mitigate against a risk 6 months ahead of time when I choose the members of the team. Because if you choose the right people, right, the right boat driver, the right safety person, the right doctor, the right camera person, the right drone photographer, the right diver, if you choose the right people, you know that if things do go wrong, they'll make the very, very best decisions. All that having been said, I feel so passionate about protecting the oceans. I realize that this is the defining issue of our generation. We'll do whatever it takes now to try and get at least 30% of our oceans fully protected now by 2030. This is my life's mission. And I hope, Georgie, to swim until the last day of my life.
Well, that's nice. I just wanted to ask it because I thought it was important. We're at the end now. We're sort of coming to a close, and I just wanted to finish. We always ask everybody if they would give sort of a performance tip for everyday people who are listening into this podcast, who aren't endurance swimmers, who aren't mental coaches, just to give a performance tip for how you would better perform every day. So what would it be, David, to people? What would you say for how you would perform better in your daily life to people? What would one tip be?
I think my most important tip would be to see the end result in your mind's eye, because that often forges the belief necessary to drive you forward. And by that, I mean, get a very clear picture of what it is that you want in your mind's eye. Make it as big and bright and bold and beautiful as possible. And I think if you have that strong vision, that strong pull towards that outcome that you're looking for, that will stand you in very good stead. Whether it is walking around the neighborhood or running a marathon, whatever it might be, getting clear on that vision and seeing that end result in your mind's eye as clearly and vividly as possible, I think that's a simple thing that you can do to help reach one's goals, whatever they might be in life.
And Lewis, how about you? What would be a performance tip for how to perform better every day from you?
I'm not sure this is a performance tip, but I'll just explain. In my mind, courage is a muscle. So courage is a muscle. So we need to exercise it on a daily basis. And if you don't, certainly when you get to my age, you soften up really, really quickly. And then you stop taking risks. And then you're on a slow road downhill. And so I think one needs to exercise that muscle all the time, keep pushing boundaries, and surround yourself by people who are courageous. Because the flip side of it is that fear is also very contagious. If you surround yourself by people who are worried and fearsome all the time, then equally you're not going to be able to do anything. So courage is really important, but you need to exercise it all the time. And then you'll be able to follow your dreams.
Those are two stonkingly good tips.
Strong.
Yeah.
Powerful.
Strong, brave, powerful, brilliant. Guys, thank you so much. It's been fascinating listening to both of you. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks very much.
Lewis, incredible the work that you've done. Really, I mean, just amazing. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Keep swimming.
Thanks a lot for being with us. Yeah, keep going.
Thank you so much, Georgie, and thank you so much, Ben. It's been wonderful speaking to you both.
Thanks for having us.
That was incredibly powerful. I mean, Lewis is out there trying to save the world, sort of on his own, but also very reliant on the team, as we heard. For me, the big takeaway, I think, was David talking about the psychology that goes into it to prepare Lewis mentally for these extreme physical challenges, and even as far as getting into the subconscious. So definitely something I'd like to take away and learn a little bit more about it. But how about you?
I think for me it's the intensity with which he sort of approaches every challenge, and that idea that I didn't really want to ask him about whether he's prepared to basically die for the mission, but that was effectively what I ended up asking. And his take on that was, I'll do whatever it takes, which is, You know, when you think about the sort of things that he's doing and the situations he's putting himself in, it's quite astounding, really. But he obviously feels that passionately about it.
He's laying it all on the line, isn't he?
Yeah, but
Yeah,
we need
amazing.
people to do that, because otherwise, how are you going to highlight just how bad the situation is and what needs to be done? Thank you for watching and listening. We are Ben and Georgie Ainsley, and this has been Performance People. And remember, from what we've learned today, courage is a muscle.